Okay, so tonight's story is chapter 10, Rip Van Winkle. Come here, Addie, let's see your shirt. Addison is loving her Poppet shirt. Come here.
I got a bow in my hand.
I see. All right, sit.
Got a bow in my hand.
Let me see your shirt. What's on there?
Unicorn Poppet.
Unicorn Poppet.
The unicorn Poppet.
Let's get to the story so we can get to bed soon. It's getting late. Rip Van Winkle. Once upon a time, there lived a man named Rip Van Winkle. Come on, hon. You're killing me.
It's on a bow.
I can't, hold this comfortably. Once upon a time, there lived a man named Rip Van Winkle with his wife, Mrs. Van Winkle. In a village in the foothills of the Catskill Mountains of America, his wife was forever nagging him, for Rip, being a good-hearted and generous man, was always ready to lend... Can you stop?
Mama, look at me.
Was always ready to lend a helping hand to his neighbors. In fact, he was always found to be doing anyone else's work except his own. His wife didn't like it. She would nag at him all day long. Rip, if you're not too busy varnishing Mrs. Green's fence today, you can mend the holes in the shed. Instead of helping to burn the farmer's rubbish, you can feed the chickens and milk the cow, she would say. Then, honey, you're moving the book. Then, if you could spare some time from building Arn Jacobs' wall, there's our potatoes to dig up and the wagon to be washed. Addie, you're really making this tough here. And the wagon to be washed down, and the gutters to be cleaned out, and the yard to be swept out. It was the same old thing every single day. Sometimes Rip Van Winkle would disappear with his faithful dog, Wolf, and shoulder his gun and walk away from his wife. He would take a stroll along the mountainside, along the river, and through the pine forest until his wife's screams had faded away. The only sound he could hear then were of the birds twittering, the rustle of the trees in the breeze, and Wolf's pants. He would have to pay when he finally went home, but the few stolen hours of silence were always worth it for him. On such afternoon, as he rested in the shade of a tree with his faithful companion, Wolf, he heard his name being called. Rip Van Winkle, Rip Van Winkle, the voice called urgently. Wolf growled at the direction of the voice, and Rip noticed that several feet away from him, a tiny green feather seemed to be trapped under the weight of the barrel. Looking closely, he noticed it was a tiny dwarf who had been trapped by the weight of the barrel he was trying to carry up the mountain. Being the kind who always helped people, Rip jumped up and freed the dwarf from under the weight of the barrel. "Thank you, Rip," he said. "Come with me now." Then he pulled the barrel and Rip along with it upwards to the mountain. After an hour of trekking, the dwarf led Rip straight through a thundering waterfall, through a hidden door, and into an enormous cavern. Dwarves were swarming everywhere. Some were dressed in aprons, pouring endless tankards of beer out of big kegs. A keg, much like the one Rip Van Winkle had helped the dwarf to carry up the mountains. Other dwarves were playing ninepins. They used smooth, round black rocks as the bowling ball and aimed it at copper skittles. They cheered loudly as they played, drank beer, and made merry. Rip's new friend, the dwarf, pulled up a chair and settled down with a mug of beer. "Help yourself," he told Rip. "After the climb, you must be very thirsty. I know I am." So Rip helped himself to a beer and immediately felt rather sleepy. "This is powerful," he exclaimed. But he was tempted to drink even more. When he could no longer fight being tired and sleepy, Rip Van Winkle dozed off. He awoke many hours later and realized it was already night. He was horrified, thinking his wife would never stop nagging him now. The cavern where he had fallen asleep was deserted now. There was no sign of any dwarves around. "I must have slept through the day," he thought in horror. He looked for his gun. When he found it, he saw that instead of being clean and shiny, it was now rusty and wouldn't work. He whistled for his dog, he whistled for his dog, but even he was nowhere to be seen. Feeling bemused, he climbed down the mountains and back to his house. She pays attention so well. It's like I'm reading stories to myself. When he tried to open the gate of his cottage, he found to his surprise that it was locked. A woman came running out yelling at him, "Hey, why are you trying to get inside my house?" "Your house?" Rip asked, surprised. Then he noticed that the curtains that hung in the windows were not his. Neither was the wagon stationed before the house. "But where's Mrs. Van Winkle?" "She left 20 years ago," said the woman, "after her husband went up the mountainside and never came back down again." 20 years, thought Rip Van Winkle in shock. He made his way to the local inn and there discovered that everyone he knew before were already pretty old. He made to stroke his chin and realized that he now had a foot-long beard. "Do you people remember name Rip Van Winkle?" he asked everyone at the inn. "Oh, yes," said the innkeeper. "He was a good fellow. Went up the mountainside one day and never came back down. His wife grew tired of waiting and left 20 years ago," said another man present at the inn. "Well, I am Rip Van Winkle," Rip announced. And the inn was abuzz with curiosity, with everyone wanting to know where he had been all these years. So Rip Van Winkle began to live in his old village again among his people and did not go to look for his nagging wife. And whenever everyone heard his story, Rip did not have to buy another beer for himself again. The end. And that was actually the end of this book, it seems. That was a very strange story. But I guess at least he got rid of his nagging wife. Elsa looks beautiful.
She have a bow.
Are you ready for bed?
Yeah.
You don't look like it. I love you.
I like you.
Good night.
I like that.
Good night.
Good night.
So I guess I'll have to look tomorrow for another story to read to myself, since little Miss Addison does not like to pay attention to my stories. That is the end of Children's Classic stories. Volume 1. Maybe there's a volume 2. I'll have to check.